Good afternoon. Thank you, Dean Crawford, for the kind introduction, and also, once again, I am very proud to be the first recipient of the fellowship of Professor David Schindler. We argued quite a bit when I was his student. With years, I came to, with my Thomist upbringing, I came to appreciate his position more and more. So in a sense, under his influence, my theological and philosophical positions developed. So I am very grateful to be part again of the community of John Paul II Institute. Thank you for the invitation to teach you students. It has been for 2 months great joy for me, and I am very grateful once again to be part of the faculty at the Institute and the community. So my gratitude goes to President, to the faculty, to the Dean, to the students. Thank you very much. I had the temptation to change the title of the lecture, but it's a good way to say that I developed it.
Okay.
We are close to 20th anniversary of the end of the pontificate of John Paul II. And certainly in the next 2 years, we will be listening to a lot of lectures that once again summarize the achievements of this great pontificate, one of the greatest in the history of the Church. And as I wrote in this short resume presenting my lecture, which was posted on the website of the Institute, there is no question that at the center of those summaries and those reflections about achievement of John Paul II will be a relation to the Second Vatican Council, which still remains one of the points of conflict, points of the discussion, especially since it seems that in the last pontificates, we had a certain conflict of different interpretations of Vatican II. And it has to be resolved, it has to be negotiated in the future. This will be one of the most important tasks of the future popes, and certainly our students will play an important part in this new interpretation of Vatican II. Therefore, I decided that I am not going to talk on that. You will read a lot of this, you will hear a lot of this in the next 2 years. I don't want to be repetitive here. Therefore, I developed the title of my lecture into something like that: the philosophical significance of John Paul II pontificate. The title may sound surprising to all, especially on this beautiful feast of the chair of St. Peter. By its very essence, any pontificate has primarily an obvious theological meaning, and its value should be judged first by its fidelity to the divine revelation and to the tradition of the Church, and secondly, the implementation of those in the earthly temporal sphere. However, on the other hand, the divine revelation has not only the supernatural dimension. The ancient distinction between revelabilia and revelatum reminds us that the Church not only opens before our eyes the inscrutable mysteries of God, to use the phrase from the letter to Romans, transcending our human ability to know, for example, the mystery of the inner life of the Most Holy Trinity, but revelation also confirms some truths accessible to human reason, however, often forgotten due to the illness of human condition and corrupt, dehumanizing culture. Truths belonging to the sphere of revelabilia include, for example, the possibility of discovering God's existence, some truth about God's nature, and some truth about God's nature by the power of the human reason alone. The existence in the human person of immaterial and immortal soul, dignity and equality of all men as distinguished from subhuman parts of the created world, and etc. Inspired by divine grace, which supported throughout the centuries the best parts and dynamism of the human heart, the Church not only opened before the believers the perspective of participating in the divine nature, in the eternal life, but also inspired believers to live fully human life by creating truly human culture, providing a more adequate understanding of the human person, his destiny, meaning of work, of suffering, love, social, political principles. It is true that the Church involvement in the earthly and horizontal dimension of human life has always a Christological source and character, and therefore is ultimately grounded in the Trinitarian life as offered to us in the divine revelation. Still, the Church contribution to human culture and civilization can be judged on its own, apart from its soteriological dimension. The validity and importance of such approach might be summarized at least in 4 points. I am sure there might be more of those. These are that I came with. First, if certain truths about the nature of the world, human person and God can be known thanks to the power of human reason alone, they should be proposed as the foundations for humans living together in society and culture. This is what the philosophical tradition called the natural law. The Church has a role to play not only toward the believers, but because of her universal, that is Catholic, character, should also propose rule of peaceful coexistence for all. If not the Church, then who? Secondly, the distinction between revelabilia and revelatum gives Christians a better understanding of the faith. It helps to see that central truth of the divine revelation that cannot be cognized without supernatural faith. Thirdly, this distinction has an important role in the internal process of cognition of every singular person. It points out that on different grounds we accept the validity of the truths of natural reason and revealed truths of faith. These are different processes of the internal cognition in every one of us. Fourth, the proper understanding of the autonomy of human reason is necessary for understanding the nature of supernatural faith. The faith is infused knowledge, since its basic truth cannot be proven without the supernatural gift of grace, lumen fidei. But at the same time, this analogical knowledge, according to Pseudo-Dionysius' triple distinction between via affirmationis, via eminentiae, via negationis, is grounded in the human experience and knowledge of the empirical world. The earthly and temporal is ultimately explained and enlightened by a recourse to divine. But divine first speaks the language of earthly, human experience, right? Also, reasoning inside the body of faith should respect, after all, the principles of human logic. Shortly, these are the important parts why philosophical achievement of this great pontificate can be judged and can be appreciated and can be seen, in a sense, on its own. Of course, these analyses rest on the fundamental assumption that there is a certain continuity between philosophy of Karol Wojtyła and his theology, as well as theology of John Paul II. This continuity, typical for any great thinkers in the Christian tradition, for Augustine, for Church Fathers, Gregory of Nyssa, for Thomas Aquinas, for Bonaventure. This continuity in John Paul II can easily be detected in such different papal pronouncements as his Wednesday Catechesis on the Theology of the Body, but also his encyclicals, for example, Veritatis Splendor et Fides et Ratio. So let me start this exposition after these opening remarks. Let me start this exposition of the philosophical significance of the pontificate, of teaching of John Paul II. I would like to concentrate on 3 points. The first one is I called epistemological realism and bodily roots of human cognition. The second one, it's called appreciation of human subjectivity and its integration into the rational and objective structure of the person. And the third one is called personalist participation in the humanity of the other as a way to change a stranger into a neighbor. There is no question that my talk tonight, I am grateful for the inspiration to my students, whom I see here. They may be bored during this lecture, for sure, because I will be repeating some of the points that I have already made during the lecture. But your presence and your questions and the whole discussion during the class certainly helped me to see certain truths. So therefore I decided to kind of freshly to share these with you. Let me start with the first point, the epistemological realism and bodily roots of human cognition. With Immanuel Kant was one of the first encounters in Wojtyła's path of arriving and his own way of thinking. Throughout the 19th century, Kant's critical philosophy posed a serious challenge to Catholic natural philosophy, realistic epistemology, and ethics. In his first and most important Lublin lecture, presented at the Catholic University of Lublin in the academic year 1953-54, it could be a year later, I don't recall. Thanks to the Institute, we have finally excellent English translation of this important text. Wojtyła there analyzes Kant's ethics from the point of view of the most fundamental ethical question: how a human person becomes morally good or morally evil. And what is the connection between this becoming of the human person and performing particular deeds, good or evil? To much of his surprise, Wojtyła discovers that because of his philosophical presuppositions, Kant is not able to adequately answer this question. Kantian concept of a priori moral law, as well as his constructivist epistemology, does not allow for a proper description of an ethical act. In the process of analyzing Kant, Wojtyła realizes that this description would require realistic epistemology, in which a human person is described as able to grasp the truth about different goods he or she chooses. This realistic epistemology is a precondition for a proper description of the human will, appetitus rationalis, whose becoming constitutes the becoming of the moral agent, becoming morally good or morally bad, or simply speaking, becoming a human person. Becoming human, right? Becoming human. Wojtyła's struggle with Kant had enormous consequences for the shape of his mature philosophy. First, Wojtyła realized the importance of realistic epistemology for ethics. If we are to understand human act, actus humanus, which by its very nature is ethical, because it involves freedom and reason, we have to presume that every person can get to know realistically truth about chosen goods, including the truth about the most important ethical good, the good of the human person itself. Right? The good of the human person itself. It cannot be ultimately a socially constructed good, a priori Kantian moral law, or something that just feels good. It has to be a real good of the human person, proportional to his or her being, proportional to the situation in life, to the vocation, to the place where we find ourselves, to age. The search for realistic epistemology directed Wojtyła in two directions. After his encounter with phenomenological epistemology, it moved him to reject one of the most cherished presuppositions of phenomenology, intentionality of consciousness. In this bold move, not understood and not appreciated by many contemporary readers of Wojtyła, especially with phenomenological sympathies, Wojtyła simply wants to downplay the role of consciousness in the process of human cognition. Consciousness does not have an intentional character because for Wojtyła intentionality implies an active ability to cognize the reality, to turn toward an object. Consciousness is not active for Wojtyła, is passive, is secondary. It is a cognition of what has already been cognized. The downplaying of consciousness and assigning to it a secondary role in the human cognition has profound consequences for anthropology and ethics, also in the area of theology. If it is not consciousness which provides the most important epistemological insight for the human person, which faculty does? Wojtyła did not write a complete epistemological treatise. We must reconstruct his epistemological position. It is difficult, however, to understand the realistic epistemology of Wojtyła without pointing to human body as the very source of the cognitive encounter with the reality. The Thomistic principle, nihil in intellectu, nisi in sensu, points first of all to human senses, external and internal, as the source of the human knowledge, as the first entry through which the external world comes into the process, into the door of human cognition. Appreciation of the human body becomes a critical point in rejecting, first of all, any kind of idealism that starts with the cognizing function of consciousness, but secondly, also rejecting any kind of anthropological dualism in which human person can be reduced to whatever, ego, consciousness, mind, reason, soul. Before constructing his theology of the body, Wojtyła creates a philosophy of the body. And in a sense, in this way, it should be studied. Before he does theology of the body, we have to be aware that from Lublin lectures, and especially the last Lublin lecture, Love and Responsibility, comes a certain realistic philosophy of the body, which presents a starting point for the theological interpretation of the body. We know that this philosophy of the body, which was developed by Wojtyła before the Second Vatican Council, became extremely useful in the discussion just after Vatican Council, in the discussions over Humane Vitae. It became kind of providential that Humane Vitae appears in 1968 after Wojtyła already has grappled with his philosophy of the body, thinking about body as a meaningful structure. So the meaning of the body, probably the most important word in my opinion, the theology of the body. The body has a meaning. It's not only a meaningless raw material that we, the human subject, have to colonize. It's a meaningful structure because it's part of creation. It has inscribed laws into that. We, as conscious human beings, free human beings, can develop these laws, can in a creative way work built on them, but we cannot reject them. Natura, as becomes clear in Wojtyła's project Natura, it comes from naturus, natus, being born. And being born is to own the truth of who we are to the other, to somebody that comes before us. These are the parents in the strict sense of this word, but more generally, it's the Creator, God, that made our bodies a meaningful structure for the person. So this is the first point. The realistic epistemology that needs to appreciate the bodily cognition, the bodily encounter, cognitive encounter with the world. This realistic epistemology is necessary for ethics, for the proper understanding of ethics and answer to its most fundamental questions. But realistic epistemology points out clearly in the direction of the body. The second point, appreciation of human subjectivity and its integration into the rational and objective structure of a person. This is another important point of what I would call Wojtyła's philosophical, and Wojtyła's and John Paul II philosophical defense of the perennial teachings of the Church, but in the new form, in the new language, in the new philosophy. We know that in modernity, an emphasis on human subjectivity became one of the critical points in rejecting the traditional metaphysics, the traditional anthropology, and ultimately also the teachings of the Church. So grappling with human subjectivity for Wojtyła meant encountering, in a sense, the enemy on its own territory, right? As a philosopher and theologian, Wojtyła encountered for the first time the richness of human subjectivity in his account of human love, particularly erotic love, falling in love, attraction, desire, enchantment, disenchantment, sexual drive. Analysis of these and other emotions, more or less connected to the human body, organized a large part of Wojtyła's early text written in 1950s. But that time, Wojtyła was not a stranger to the world of human emotions, largely because of his poetic works and dramas, as well as his activity as an actor. Apart from his ministry with university students for whom the question of love is existentially one of the most important, it was also the philosophical encounter with the phenomenological anthropology of Max Scheler, an example of what Alistair MacIntyre has called emotivism in After Virtue, that with the whole force presented Wojtyła with the question of relation between the subjective and objective in the human person. Describing the richness of the subjective, which points to the uniqueness of every particular person and every particular love, Wojtyła became aware that the ethical dimension of human act requires also a disclosure of the objective. The subjective cannot take out the objective dimension of the human person. The subjective of the human person also, there is a place in subjective for objective interpretation of subjective. There is something in Wojtyła, and this is of course large part of his project, as all the people present here know, there is in our experiences a space for objective experiences of the world. After all, our experiences of the world are always subjective because it's always my experience. The experience of my person, it's me. But at the same time, we can share our experiences, and we realize that in many situations we have similar experiences. Though these objective experiences point us to something common between us. So subjectivity is not totally closed for the conversation, for sharing, for this dimension which can be called intersubjectivity. Subjectivity is not closed in itself. It's open to also for the objective language, which does not take the uniqueness and the particularity of the human person, which in the modern and postmodern anthropology becomes such an obsession, right? Do not invade my subjectivity, do not invade my uniqueness with your own objective categories because I am different. So, in his book, Love and Responsibility, Wojtyła first aims at the synthesis of objective and subjective dimension of human emotion and experience, as well as an account of objective realm of the moral norms. In his philosophical and anthropological opus magnum Personae Act, written 10 years after Love and Responsibility, Wojtyła makes a clear distinction between subjective and objective dimension in the human person. Consciousness is part of the subjective. Objective dimension of the cognitive process is constituted by knowledge, self-knowledge, and what is extremely important, by conscience. It is difficult to overstate the importance of this distinction, particularly in regard to conscience. Similarly to knowledge and self-knowledge, conscience works in the realm of objective knowledge. Though in the modern culture, as we know, is so much pushed into the realm of the subjective, of the impenetrable, dimension of every singular human person. It's always my conscience that serves as a justifying of me, usually of me breaking the moral norms on the basis that it's my conscience. Nobody can from outside in any way invade it or even understand it. For Wojtyła, as it's clear from his habilitation thesis to Lublin lectures, and especially Person and Act, and of course encyclical Veritatis Splendor, conscience is subjective, but in terms of its content belongs to the realm of the objective. It needs to be objective because it has to deal with the objective goods of the human person, not to fail us. Let me go to the third point of my lecture, the theory of participation. Wojtyła theory of participation usually does not get a lot of the attention, especially in my academic circles back in Poland. Usually people concentrate on other parts of Wojtyła philosophy, but in my opinion forms one of the most interesting parts of his mature anthropology, and my students here at the Institute certainly helped me to see this again and in a fresh way. Wojtyła's theory of participation can be seen as a personalist interpretation of classical ontology of participation. Of course, it's Plato, it's Aristotle, it's Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and very venerable tradition. In Wojtyła, it presents us with a fascinating example of phenomenological inquiry about the traditional concept of the social nature of the human person. In this way, personal participation differs, it must differ, from ontological participation. In this way, it can be seen as a, again, modern exposition of the perennial teachings of the Church. Wojtyła starts from reflecting on the simple and obvious human phenomenon that often man acts with others. We act together, we do things together. This acting with others can be analyzed from two different points of view. First, there is a certain objective teleology of doing things together, which results in something being done. It is the objective end of acting together. The house was cleaned, dinner is prepared, we did it together. Secondly, there is what Wojtyła calls personalistic value of an act, of every person while acting with others. The personalistic value of an act consists in the fact that man acts in the way proper to him, that is, his actions are characterized by authentic self-determination. The transcendence of the person is realized in it. In other words, the personalistic value of an act points to the fact that it is authentic act of the person, that I am behind what I am doing, that it is vere actus humanus. I am conscious, I know what I am doing, I want to do it, I realize myself in it. True acting with others cannot overshadow or diminish the personalistic value of every particular action of persons involved. This diminishing would necessarily weaken the common good of the acting together. The common good must encompass both the objective results of acting together as well as personalistic values of particular actions of persons involved. In order to act with others while preserving the personalistic value of own actions, every member of the community must be involved in the exchange, dialogue with others on the topic of goods and ends, of acting together, doing things together. This dialogue points to the center of personalistic theory of participation. It is about participating in the inner life of the other person, in the humanity of the other. So we have the idea of conversation, the ancient dialogue, dialogos, the word that is created between two persons involved. Participating in the inner life of the other, Wojtyła says, we may choose certain goods, certain actions, not necessarily because this would be my first choice, but because others choose it. And choose exactly what others choose. I do it, but only for the sake of the community, for the other. Among the different goods that we choose, there is a particular good, the other person chosen as a good for me, a co-worker, friend, family member, spouse. Choosing the other person as a good for me implies two other choices. First, choosing as my goods the goods chosen by the other. Communicatio in bonum is for Aristotle and Aquinas a condition for true friendship. There must be agreement as to what goods bind us together. But secondly, choosing the other person as a good for me opens before us the perspective that the other person is the other I, and he, she has to be consciously affirmed, accepted as the other I, as the other subjectivity. Wojtyła calls this act an affirmation. For Robert Spemann, it is awakening. This is awakening to a consciousness that every one of us who is I lives in the world of multiple I's, multiple subjectivities, multiple centers of the world. However, as in the theory of the participation, these centers of the world are penetrable to each other. They are not separate. There is participatio, possibility of participatio. Karol Wojtyła's theory of participation may be seen as a phenomenological reinterpretation of the classical doctrine of the social nature of man, and in this way polemics with modern individualism. But it can also be seen as a polemics with the idea, postmodern idea, of a stranger, alien, the other as the other, so much present in today's anthropology. It is the idea of the other as a stranger that does seem to be at the root of a certain idea of diversity that so much damages our societies. We know that the idea of the other and other has been created after Second World War as a fruit of the reflection of what went so terribly wrong in the Western culture as to lead to this terrible destruction of human lives. The response of some Jewish thinkers, Emanuel Levinas, Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, pointed to certain intellectual reduction of dignity and uniqueness of the human person, subjectivity of the human persons, that preceded the mechanisms of totalitarian mass destruction and particularly Holocaust. In other words, it was, as they say, the metaphysical framework or the objective framework. By that, they usually mean the metaphysics of Hegel, that help dehumanize the world of persons, rob them of their dignity, subjectivity, and uniqueness. If we are not to make a similar mistake in the future these philosophers held, we have to give up the reductive approach of understanding the other and treat the other simply as the other, as incomprehensible stranger that points to this irreducibility of the human person. Paradoxically, today we already know that treating the other simply as the other can also be dehumanizing for both parties involved. This giving up on truth, explanation and conversation in order to save the dignity and uniqueness of every individual has fragmented our societies into impenetrable and hostile groups that speak different languages, profess different values, live in different cultures that do not communicate. Difference is not enough to live together. Wojtyła's philosophical approach, which expresses a classical and perennial Christian tradition, aims at building human bonds without reducing the other, without negating the subjectivity and uniqueness of the human person. Through participation, Wojtyła says, stranger becomes a neighbor. The neighbor, when Wojtyła uses this word in the last part of the person and act, neighbor, of course, comes from the Christ commandment, love your neighbor. In Polish, the word neighbor is expressed by beautiful word bliźni. I will not require you to repeat this. Bliźni comes from the word, so bliźni is not necessarily a neighbor. Bliźni is the other person, everyone, every person, but bliźni comes from the word blisko. And blisko means to be close. In other words, a stranger becomes bliźni when he is not far away, when he gets closer, when he is being recognized. So he is not far away, he is closed. As we discussed it with my students at one of the classes, I understand that this may be also the root actually of the word neighbor, that also it may come from the word near. So neighbor is not necessarily the person who lives close, but neighbor is the one first who is near me. So stranger can become a neighbor through this participation, through the participation in his or her humanity. Wojtyła's philosophical theory of participation has multiple applications, also in his theology. In his first major theological work, Sources of Renewal, from 1968, Wojtyła described with this philosophical theory the Christian participation in the life of Christ, particularly in his triple function as king, prophet, and priest. So we participate as Christians in the inner life of Christ and in the inner life of Trinity. It can be analyzed from this personalist point of view. We usually analyze it from the ontological point of view. That's what traditional metaphysical theology used to do. But perhaps there is a way to analyze this participation in the life of Christ, in the human life of Christ, and in the divine light of Christ, from this point of view of exchange, of personalist participation. It would be, of course, be also extremely interesting to apply the theory of participation to the analysis of communio personarum, a particular human community which is created by the mutual gift of oneself, a surrender of one's own liberty. The communio personarum is realized, after all, between every Christian and God, as well in some human situations, for example, marriage. Let me summarize some of the points. As you see, presenting the importance of John Paul II pontificate, I have decided to rest on his philosophical achievements. However, those philosophical achievements are not just a particular achievements of a particular philosopher. It seems to me that the three achievements that I presented form cornerstones of classical church tradition teaching about human person. The necessity for realistic encounter, cognitive encounter with reality as necessary for human ethics, for knowing what we are to choose for our good, for the flourishing of the human person. The importance of the human body I touched on the cognitive dimension, but certainly as in the theology of the body, it can be much expounded. The whole discussion about subjectivity of the human person as pointing to the uniqueness of every subject, but at the same time not closed in itself, but open to a understanding, open to conversation and open to dialogue. We may create what in the phenomenological tradition has been called intersubjectivity. We can build bridges, objective bridges of dialogos between different subjects. And thirdly, the theory of participation as providing anti-individualist proposal and solution to our fragmented communities where, for fear of reducing the uniqueness of persons, we give up on building unity, of building communities. In this fragmented and divided world, John Paul II proposed a certain universal and perennial language, able on the one hand to appreciate the human person. Therefore, we can call it a personalist anthropology, a personalist approach to the human person. But at the same time, this personalist approach is able to build bridges for human communication and communion. Every one of these truths, perennial truths, is grounded not just in particular philosophical or theological theory, but is grounded in the universal human experience and is open to further philosophical but foremost theological explanation and deepening. After all, a partial explanation of things is not an enemy of a full explanation of things. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.